Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Abrar Chaudhary, and I'm a senior research fellow at Said Business School, working on areas of climate finance and sustainability. It's my absolute pleasure and honor to be speaking to you, and thank you for your time for attending this session. I want to start with a question that I think sits at the very heart of what we're trying to achieve in this summit. There is a great deal of funding committed to tackling climate change, and yet it consistently fails to reach communities most exposed to the effects of climate change. Why is that the case? And that's what we are going to explore together over the next 30 minutes. So, on that note, let me share my slides and get right into it. I want to start with the story. In 2010, Pakistan, where I grew up, experienced what the UN called the worst humanitarian disaster it had ever witnessed. One-fifth of the country was underwater, 30 million people were displaced, and there was a $10 billion economic loss. And this is in a country that contributes less than 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Uh, Everyone called it the flood of the century, and Pakistan ended up paying an extraordinary price for a crisis it did not cause. So, when we talk about climate finance, the question is, where does it go? And why did it not reach the people who needed it the most in Pakistan? So, the numbers on this slide actually tell a story of a profound mismatch. By 2050, climate change will cost the global economy $38 trillion each year. And these figures are coming from credible, peer reviewed research. And this accounts for damages from heat, flooding, drought, disruptions to our food and water systems, systems that are absolutely necessary for our survival. And now look what the international community committed in response. In 2009, developed nations under the global climate negotiations pledged to give $100 billion by 2020, and this is in 2009, to help developing countries cope with the impacts of climate change. And that's another story that, how much of that money was received. But in short, these numbers were never fully reached. The expectation was that, we would, we would have massive numbers coming in, but we weren't even able to reach the $100 billion. So, all the developing countries came together at COP29 in 2024 and demanded actually $1.3 trillion to deal with the impacts of climate change. And in response, developed countries only committed $300 billion, which was an increase from the $100 billion, but much short from what was demanded. But that too for 2030. While research shows that the actual cost or the actual funding that's required is $2.4 trillion. So if you look at the $100 billion right now and the $2.4 trillion, there's a factor of 24. That's the number, that's the time we need to increase our funding just to get to the number of what's really needed. So it really shows this scale of mismatch. But even if the money was there, there are three deep structural problems that need to be addressed um, for why money doesn't reach frontline communities which need it the most. First is a definition problem. Second is a metrics problem. And third is a funding gap. Let me take you through each of these in turn. So here's something that would surprise you that there isn't a single agreed definition of climate finance. The UNFCCC, which is the main body for Climate Negotiation defines it as finance for reducing emissions and building resilience, whereas the European Investment Bank may focus on low carbon and climate resilient development. G20 talks about how do we shift existing financial flows towards the environment. And when it comes to the private sector, it's a big unknown because there's so many different organizations and funds and companies that each have their own definition. And why does this matter? Although the definitions are not widely different, but even that slight difference in the language has great implications in practice because funders use their own definitions when they decide what to fund. And applicants have to satisfy those definitions to access money. And in case it doesn't happen and projects get rejected, this is what happens in practice. And it's not because the underlying work is not credible or is it bad, but because they cannot prove what funders want to see is the climate rationale, the climate science. It's the language. It's about, does the science support the funding? Does the science support the project? If you were to build a project, would it actually help with dealing with impacts of climate change? And when we look at the local adaptation work, it becomes extremely challenging because protecting a community from flooding, restoring a watershed, building drought resilient food system, these are very hard to classify. And they don't neatly fit into a single definition. When it comes to youth-led projects and community organizations, the scrutiny is even higher. You have to demonstrate that your work qualifies as climate finance before you even get to the question of whether it's effective. So the key message here is never assume your climate rationale that it's obvious. You have to state it explicitly in the language of the specific funder you're applying to. And that's always the mismatch. Maybe the example here is, people applying for jobs. If you don't tailor your CV according to the job requirement, according to the organization, you often get rejected at the first place. And so it's really important to think about the language of what's required. The second challenge is about what gets measured, and therefore what gets funded. And here, in climate, we make this distinction between mitigation and adaptation. So mitigation finance is about finance helping to reduce emissions. And this is relatively easy to measure. You can count the tons of CO2 saved. So for instance, when you build a large solar farm, you can measure the output, you can calculate how much fossil fuel emissions were displaced, so you're no longer using fossil fuels. And you can actually build a single number and you can actually present it to a funder. And that's clear, it's bankable, the private sector loves it. And that's what we see. About 90% of all tracked finance goes to mitigation. In 2023 alone, $1.9 trillion was tracked to mitigation alone, just for that single reason that it's measurable, it can be measured, and therefore it gets funded. When we come to adaptation finance, and this is more about reducing the impacts on communities. Climate change has happened, and so how do we help communities deal with the shocks of climate change? This is a fundamentally different beast. How do you actually measure resilience? It depends on the type of hazard that you're exposed to. What level of protection are you aiming for? Which communities are we working for, and what time frame are we saying? And these questions don't have a universal answer. They're locally specific, and that makes adaptation much harder to package, harder to sell, and much less attractive for private capital. And we can see that in numbers. Adaptation gets about 10% of all climate finance. And that's just $63 billion dollars in 2023. Whereas, research shows that there's actually a need of between 200 to 400 billion dollars by developing countries to deal with the impacts of climate change. So there's a massive gap of how much money is available for adaptation, for local communities, for countries that are most vulnerable, and how much is needed. And that gap is widening. Um, but there's also like another very shocking number that comes up. This is research by the International Institute for Environmental and Development, IIED, that tracked 8 years of climate finance data. And what they saw was when looked at the transaction, only 0.17%, 0.17%, that's less than two in every $1,000 was described as locally led or community led. That means local communities were in charge of those projects, and that funding was actually helping local communities deal with those shocks. That's less than a quarter of a percent of all funding. So, what we see is that those most at risk at receiving are receiving the least. And the community is most likely to design genuinely effective projects because they're closest to that impact and understand the local context are the ones being excluded. So I want to point here, maybe say it again, 0.17, 0.17% actually goes to locally led projects, which is a shocking number. The third challenge is the simplest, but in some ways is the most frustrating because we've had promises that were never kept. Like in 2009, developing, as I said, developing nations pledged $100 billion a year by 2020. And that deadline passed. We never really got to that number. And, to be fair, there are many different analyses that, bring in different forms of funding and try to show that we've actually reached the $100 billion. But in reality, that money never made it. It was always falling short. And by 2022, we barely made it to about $90 billion. And that's, when you think of the impact that a single country like Pakistan had, it needed $10 billion, then this $90 billion for all countries, all developing countries, doesn't seem to be fair. And the demand has been $300 billion, which again has not been met. And this is again going to happen in 2030. So, all the developing country nation leaders are coming back and saying, look, it's not just the money, it's the actual architecture of climate finance that is creating vulnerability for nations. So what we see in summary are the numbers are large, the commitments are serious, but the delivery is very slow in terms of the gap between what's promised and the reality on ground and where it's needed. And that's the third challenge that we see. So I've given you the challenges, but these problems are real, but they're not unsolvable. And I want to offer you three concrete directions. And these are not complete answers, but it's a frame for you to think about what change could look like. So, solution number one is we have to get the science right. We have to get the right language for projects. Solution B really focuses on how do we define adaptation with precision, and I focus on adaptation, not mitigation, because that's the real need for developing countries. Mitigation has a clear plan, has a clear approach, and it is being funded, maybe not at the scale that's required, but it's getting 90%. So I think we're okay on that part. But it's the adaptation that gets less than 10%. So how do we define that? And then finally, how do we start to engage private sector through innovative finance? What is their role? Because it seems that they're often on sitting on the sidelines. So the first element is that most projects sadly fail even before they're submitted. And not, as I said, it's not because it's a bad idea, not because the need isn't real, but because the proposal cannot demonstrate the funder's language. But this is fixable, but it requires investment in preparation. My biggest argument for funders, for global organization is that, we don't just need funding, we need the capability to develop strong proposals. And so there are opportunities. For example, the Green Climate Fund recognizes this challenge, and there are also other multilateral funds that have developed specific funding to develop strong projects. So it's not funding for the projects, but it's funding for preparing those projects. So we have a project preparation facility from Green Climate Fund and other funders that actually give money. You can apply for that, and it's not, again, a simple process, but there is a pathway. There is the model that other funders can follow. And it covers funding for developing feasibility, stakeholder consultation, getting the science right, getting the social impacts right. So you develop a strong project that can be then funded. And that's money coming in to build the right evidence. There's also money that comes in to help countries get ready for climate change. So again, I'll use the example of Green Climate Fund. I think it offers 3 million, and now it's increasing that money to $7 million each year to help countries develop a list of bankable projects or develop a list of projects that they want to focus on, get the science right. Right. And there are also many other entry points like the Adaptation Fund, the Small Grants Program. I was involved in a very interesting UNDP project that I worked over the last 2 years, and we had many of the students involved in it, which was offering money up to $250,000 to local community projects, locally led community projects to demonstrate that their solutions can build resilience. And now the next point is that, once you build that solution, and these solutions could be anywhere from, fisheries or sustainable agriculture. And once you build those solutions, then, you know, the idea for UNDP and other funders was to help them scale and get other funding as well. So my point here is that these models are approaching, and my urge for all of you would be that look, talk to your local governments, focus inwards first, see what sort of readiness funding or project preparation facilities or small grants are available that can help you develop your projects. And start early. Don't come up with a finished project and feel disappointed, but actually start these conversations early, build the evidence before approaching a funder, and build your climate rationale much more strongly, explicitly in writing, so that you have a strong base for approaching projects. And I think that's the first approach: strong project proposals. The second solution is about language and framing, and specifically, this is for adaptation projects. Funders often reject adaptation projects because the proposals are very vague, right? And the most common form of vagueness is describing the problem at the wrong level of abstraction. So, you may go in with a project which says, "Oh, the problem is flooding," but flooding is not a problem statement. Drought is not a problem statement. A problem statement names the specific hazard, the specific affected population, the specific change that you are trying to create, and the time frame over which you want to measure it. So, three questions your proposal must be able to answer: from what, to what, for whom, and added to it, over what time frame. So it's not just flooding that you're applying for, but for example, it would be increasing food security, increasing flood. The challenge would be increasing flood frequency in low-lying agriculture districts of coastal Bangladesh, for example. And this is driven by a combination of sea level rise or intensifying monsoon events. The two what would then be, it wouldn't be just improve resilience, but smallholder farmers able to maintain, let's say, 80% of baseline yield in a 1 in 10 year flood event by 2030. So you're being very specific here. And for whom? Not just communities, because that's a very, what do we mean by community? But it could be for women smallholder farmers in three specific districts, and using a rights-based approach that specifically addresses the challenges of climate risk by gender over a 5 year period. So now you can see the difference. That the difference is between very vague, saying I need money for flooding for local communities, to being very precise. And this changes whether your project actually works because it forces you to understand the problem before you design the solution. And this is my big task for young people is like, look, if you want to get funding for climate, understand the problem, go on the ground, and be very, very specific and clear in what you're trying to do. Not be abstract. Oh, I need food for, or I need funding for building food security. That's a very broad, abstract thing. Be specific, and you will become specific when you go on ground, and that is what actually gets funded. So this brings me to locally led adaptation as well. Um, and this is something, a movement that's been happening, which is about building this locally led adaptation capacity. More than 130 governments have now formally endorsed this concept of locally led adaptation. And the idea here is that communities, under the locally led adaptation approach, that communities should design their own climate responses with local organizations holding funding and with long term flexible support rather than short term cycles. And the idea here is to empower the people who are closest to the problem and not just empowering them to deal with the problem, but actually financing them in a way that it's not like for a year or a 2 year, but a long term approach. And so I think that notion is started to rise. And I gave you the example of the UNDP accelerator that's been working across 33 countries, trying to create evidence and trying to do things differently. But then going back to this figure of 0.17%, that's the amount of money actually going there. So the gap is wide, but it also then creates an opportunity to work in this space. So finally, the third solution is much more structural, and I'll spend a little bit of time explaining this because I think this is something where we always talk about how do we get private sector to get involved in climate finance. So one thing is very clear that public grants alone cannot close the climate finance gap. And if you look at the numbers that come in, grants are less than 5% of total climate finance. So we're all looking for grants. So think of that number, 5%, the whole world is competing for those grants. It's not going to happen. And then the second source of climate finance is actually commercial debt. This is just going to going to a bank and getting a loan for 20 or 15, depending on which country you are. And there's a whole question of equity that comes in. So the question is, isn't how to replace private finance with public money. It's how to use public money to make adaptation bankable for private investors. And I know a lot of people don't like this notion of bankability, but the reality is that if you want to talk to private sector, we have to talk in their language as well, which means we have to show them that this is a project that can give a return, is a bankable, attractive project. So let me give you an example here. Imagine, you had a 220 or $200 million project, and the 20 million is just the initial grant for you to like develop, build capacity, understand the science. But imagine you're looking for $200 million. You first get like this if you go to a private sector and say, look, I need $200 million to build this adaptation project. First of all, chances are very low because they'll say, you know prove your climate science, prove your rationality, what will happen, what's the return. And then even if they agree, they'll say, okay, $200 million will give you at 10%. That's $20 million dollars in interest. That would most likely make the project not very viable. A blended approach, on the other hand, is like, going to your government, going to Green Climate Fund, going to other organizations and saying, look, can we get or a concessional loan? Concession loan means you get $100 million at a much lower interest rate, 5%, which is fine because the institutions that are giving you that loan are happy. They're impact driven. So or it's their mandate. So they're happy to take a lower interest. And they also commit to that if anything goes wrong, we are the first ones that will lose our money. When you have that instrument, then you can go to a private sector and say, look, I have this concessionality. I have this first loss option. Can I get $100 million? And they would listen now because their risk is covered, or at least this risk is lowered. And if they're still getting the same return, then at a lower risk, the option of getting that funding actually goes higher. So you're able to attract private sector funding. What happens to the project when you combine the two source of funding? The actual interest rate falls. So instead of paying 10%, you're actually paying 7.5%. And that, in many cases, there are different variations that are coming in. But the risk is now redistributed. So the public sector is taking more risk, the private sector is taking less risk, and the overall interest rate comes in. And this is important because this is the mainstream policy position. And it matters for youth entrepreneurs, for young people, and organizations, and people who are listening here, that if you can demonstrate bankable climate rationale, and if you can show that your project addresses a measurable adaptation challenge with a viable return, you can access equity finance, not just grants. So there are examples coming. So I do urge you to spend time thinking about those elements. So just at the end, now we're just approaching the end. I do want to be honest with you about something because I think you deserve more than just a technocratic answer. Everything I've told you so far, fix the definition, refine the metrics, use the preparation pathways, structure the blended finance, this represents the mainstream reform position. And I truly believe these things matter. Having spent so many years talking to different actors, this is very important to unlock finance. But it also, but they all assume that the system can be fixed. If we just kept doing this, the system can be fixed from the inside by just doing it better, by better technical practice. But there is a second view as well, and this comes from serious scholars all across the world, and not just from the fringes. So, for example, Daniela Gabor at the University of West of England calls the current approaches the Wall Street consensus. And this is a model which is very interesting because what it's saying is that this is a model, when you look at blended finance, in which public institutions, governments, de-risk private sector investment. So what they do is they transfer public risk to taxpayers. So in a way, your taxpayer money is allowing private sectors to capture their returns. And so in this way, the push for blending finance isn't a solution to the access problem. It's a reframing of climate adaptation as an investment opportunity for the private sector, which I think systematically excludes areas in communities where there is no viable return. So if you have no return, you can't get blended finance, you can't get private sector in, you won't have public sector de-risking it. So it just prioritizes areas where there are opportunities. And I think that's not equitable. And that's another challenge why money doesn't go to places where it's needed. Other scholars talk about climate colonialism. And what they're saying is that really, if you look at the climate finance structures, or the funds that are being set up, and that's the research I also do. If you look at GCF, you look at new climate funds that are coming up, they replicate many of the models or structural dynamics for earlier development finance, which means the the recipient countries are have to conform to donor defined governance norms. So if I go to a climate fund, although it's improving, I have to say that there's a lot of work that's going on. But if I go to many of the multilaterals, I get funding based on their requirements. They will set the standards. It's not about my right. If I suffer from floods in Pakistan, and I go in and look, I didn't cause this. I need money and funding because it's my right. I may get money, but it will come with lots of conditionality. So they're also saying that it's, just replicating existing power models. It's nothing new. And then finally, my own research looks at these deeper structural problems. And what I study is that what can't be measured doesn't get funded. And so there's so many, when we look at adaptation resilience, there's so many other elements than just financial return that actually build resilience. There's social cohesion, there's a lot of traditional ecological knowledge, there's institutional trust, there's community decision making capacity, and these are really, really important elements to build resilience in a community. And we see that, like, community, youth groups coming together, working with each other, building that positive momentum to solve these problems, to build resilience, and they're just not factored in. And so they're just counted as the same, or actually a project that can offer commercial benefit will be ranked higher to build resilience than real projects or communities that are building social cohesion, are building networks, are doing, are benefiting from their local knowledge. They don't get funded. So these are things that we can't just ignore. These are structural problems. So I raise this point not to be pessimistic, but I raise it because the question that is the system broken, or are we working exactly for a system that's designed? Is this how things are supposed to happen? And I want you to question that. And for young people listening here and spending their time to hearing about climate finance and equity, and you will be building the next generation of institutions. And I think these are really important questions that I leave with you to think about. Like, what is the system that you want to create, and how will you challenge the system that exists? So you're not just taking what's coming to you, but you're also thinking about, is this funding fair or not? So, I know it's a deep way to end this, rather than giving you like just solutions, but I think it's really important. Um, so let me quickly close, like give you a quick summary of what we discussed, right? With three things I most want you to take from this session, right? On the problem side, the barriers are not random. Um, we have unclear definitions, exclude locally led work. The adaptation funding gap is structural, it's not accidental, and international pledges that have a 20-year track record of being made and not kept. Those are the problems. On the solution side, you have to demonstrate your climate rationality very explicitly. You have to be clear what you are asking for. Define your adaptation challenge with precision, from what hazard to what change in resilience, for which specific community and over what time frame. And if you're building organizations or ventures, learn the language of blended finance. Don't be left behind. Like, jump into it, because that's the language private sector understands. That's where public and private structures are going to be built. And that's how the majority of capital will move. So this is what you need to do. And on your role, specifically, I would, I know it's hard, but I would, encourage you to engage with your national and local governments early. go to them, understand what sort of programs they're building. There are a lot of small grants that allow you to test your projects. There are lots of ventures, venture studios, incubators. All those areas are there. But build local evidence, like solve the right problems. Just don't like come up with a solution because you think this will be fundable. Come up with a problem that really helps with climate change, because the whole essence is getting funding to where it's needed. So if you build a solution which the communities don't need but it gets funded, it's not really helping the cause. Connect with climate funds also. Go to their websites, understand their opportunities, understand the readiness program, the small grants. Hold the system to account, because the gap between the commitments governments make in international forums and the reality on ground in countries like Pakistan is not a technical problem, it's a political problem. So the finance exists. The question is access. And access is a question of power, of governance, of whose knowledge and whose priorities get shaped and what happens next. So focus on those things. And then finally, I started with Pakistan. I want to quickly close with Pakistan as well. 2010 floods were called the flood of the century. Once a century, one in 100 years. And 12 years later, we had an even bigger flood, one that submerged one third of the country. And that's, imagine the entire land of UK. Um, 30 from 10 billion, a $30 billion loss. And, millions um, went under poverty. And if you see the graph for Pakistan, it's actually not a great graph. It's one of the few countries where poverty levels have been going up dramatically, while many of the other countries have been able to work in reducing poverty. So, same country, 12 years later, a worse disaster. Um, and again, I would say, Pakistan did not cause it, um, but it is paying a price. And this is the work we have to do. And it is ours to do. How do we get funding from where it's needed to communities and people and places that need it the most? So thank you for your attention. I hope this was useful for you, and good luck with the rest of the summit. Thank you so much.